So now it's time for section 8 of my ownership lecture, and it will be the summary of this categorization and differences of owners. The section 7 was about business groups, and that before was about families, those that are quite characteristic and interesting ways of organizing the corporate governance of listed firms. But now it's time to make a summary of these ideas. And here is the slide, summary and effects. The total summary is here. Of course, I cannot go into every part here, and I don't need to, because this is just those that I made in the slides in the previous 3 sections. It's a way to try to show that there is a huge diversity of owners. You cannot really find 2 ownership categories here that are the same, that are similar. Some of them are quite close to each other. For example, families and business groups could look very similar, and they are the ones that have an active governance strategy. Then we have 2 of those that are passive. But then also, if you look at these, there is not this ownership structure when there is no identifiable main owner, because these are owners. And you could imagine to have an ownership structure where the dominant owner, when there is no dominant owner, there is just a dispersed ownership. Maybe that is the thing that is most characteristic of US and UK, but not in the continent, in Europe or in Asia, and not in Sweden either. So I would say, if you remember the first slide I show you of the parrots, all the same, and the savanna, where there were a multitude of animals. This is not much of a multitude. It's 6 categories, but it's a multitude. Maybe you could yourself think that you could find even more variety. For example, financial funds could be subdivided into others, more specific funds. So we have to say that there is a multitude of owners, and maybe that is good. Maybe it's good to have ownership market and structure where you have a multitude of owners. So different owners can choose different corporations, and different corporations can attract different kind of owners. But then you think, is there this case? Now we have been dealing with them separately, but they are in an ownership structure. So you can have one investment fund, one pension fund, and one representative of the business group. Do they cooperate? Well, we have this, what has been characterized in studies is the principal problem. When you have different owners, they can come in a conflict. And the principal problem is that one of the owners will try to will exploit the other owner. That's quite a very US, UK perspective, that if there are differences, there is a conflict. There is no consensus seeking. But why not think about it like an opportunity? If you have this tradition of consensus and cooperation, why not try to find out, well, we are different. Could we complement each other? Do we need to compete with each other because we are different? Or could we maybe complement, maybe even in a cooperation? So that would be fascinating to find out, if we find connections between, for example, business groups and families could cooperate very well because they look so very similar. Or maybe You should have a financial fund and the business group. Maybe they can cooperate very much because they are not similar at all. They complement each other. Therefore, they create these incentives of cooperation. These are very good questions, I admit. I do not have any answer, and I would claim that not other people have answers either, because we don't have a theory of cooperation between owners. We have a theory saying that if they are not similar, they will have a conflict. But when will they have inducement for cooperation? So there is a high demand on the theory of trying to find out what are the inducements for cooperation between owners. Can we find cooperation between owners, and could we explain this cooperation? There is a demand, you do it. Now let's look at the ownership effects, because we claim that there are differences between them. Then we expect them to act differently, and then we expect them also to have effects. As I said, some studies show that the family ownership can even create higher financial benefits for corporations, higher profitability. And I claimed in my discussion about business group that business groups are very efficient organizations. That's why they exist, and that's why they have been able to exist for so many years. But let's look at another ownership effect. I've done one study trying to find out the effects. But in order to do it, you have to understand the theory behind it. That is the governance of the firm. So this is now you know about the main idea from economics, that there is a center of the rights that then are delegated, or there is this specialization. Now this paper is made, this idea is within the economics tradition, that there are rights, they are delegated. And what are the rights? Well, these are the ownership functions, I claim. The functions to develop the strategy of the firm, the functions to structure the firm so it can implement this strategy, and then the function to monitor the strategy of the firm. These are three very basic functions of ownership. So now I'm not dealing with this residual thing and all these things. This is more hands-on. As an owner, you are influencing the development of the strategy of the firm, the structure of the firm, monitoring the strategy implementation of the firm. These functions, in order to perform them, you have to assume principal cost. Normally in agency theory, you talk about agency costs. An agency cost is what you lose when you have an agent, what you have to do in order to make that agent act in your interest. But principal cost, that is a cost that you have as an owner. You have to do investment in competence. And to make investment in competence, everyone knows that that is a costly affair. In fact, you now that are looking at this, you make an investment, you consume time, listen to me, looking at my slides, and hoping that you will gain a competence that you can use in your future life. So that is an investment in competence. I hope that you don't feel it's too high. Then you have to make an investment in information. You have to get some data. You read articles. That is an investment in information. And then you invest in networks. Know people, because if you know people, you can get more information, you can get access to their competence, and then you become much more clever yourself. So these are costs: to invest in competence, to invest in information, to invest in networks. Now let's look at this separation of ownership and control. And now the idea is not specialization, it's delegation of ownership functions. So let's look at the development of strategy. Who is developing the strategy? Well, it should be the owner. It should be the owner that structure the firm and monitor the strategy. But now we have this delegation. One could imagine that you develop the development of the strategy, you are delegated. Well, you are engaged maybe if you are a business group or if you are a family, but you also delegate part of the development to the board and maybe to the top management team, maybe. In US listed firms, you delegate everything to the top management team. The structure of the firm, who structure the firm? Well, you delegate it to the board that makes decision about if you would like to have it multi-divisional or not. But even more, you delegate it to the top management team. They are, because structure of the firm is how you implement the strategy, and the top management team responsibility is to implement. So of course they structure the firm, but the decision is probably made at the board level, but maybe not at the owner. And then monitor the strategy. Who is monitoring the strategy? Maybe you as an owner, you make some monitoring, but you delegate it not to the top management team as they do in the US, because that is the one that is populating the board. But in the Swedish system, the board is independent of the top management team. So you delegate the monitoring on the strategy that is really effectually made by the top management team to the board. So this is the delegation. Structure of the firm, much delegated, develop of the strategy, delegated between board and top management team, and the monitoring of the strategy delegated to the board. When you do that, this delegation, then of course you don't have to invest yourself in competence as a principal, as an owner. You don't have to invest in a lot of competence in how to structure a firm, because that is made by the top management team or the board. But then you delegate also the cost, because if you ask, for example, the board to develop the strategy, they have to be able to develop the strategy. So they have to have the competence. So they have to do these competence investments. So that is why I'm writing here that what you do is that you distribute the principal cost. It has its origin at the owners, and then it's distributed to the board and to the top management team that have to assume these activities and therefore consume those resources, which is a cost. And then the more you delegate, according to agency theory, the more you create agency cost. And agency cost has its origin not at the owner, but at the top management team, those that are employed. So the more that you distribute your principal cost to other actors, the board and top management team, the more agency costs will be created. And of course, in order to reduce agency cost, you would like to invest in incentive systems or more in monitoring system. And that is the agency cost. So what's happening? What is happening is that if you are, as an owner, you put more responsibility of the strategy development on the board, the board have to be consuming more resources, so it's a little bit more costly. And then, since you put it on the board, you get the agency problem and the agency cost, so it's even more costly. So the delegation is costly, and of course, but you do it because you hope that these costs, the principal cost and the agency cost together, will be less than the revenues you get by having a competent board developing the strategy. So you always have to think that principal cost and agency cost have to be met by revenues. There is some revenue. This is the specialization revenue, when you find more competent people than yourself. So then we translated these ideas into a governance strategy trying to predict board compensation. So we said that there is one governance strategy that we call financial governance strategy. It's you could say this passive governance strategy. It's typical for institutional investor like funds, domestic or foreign. Now you recognize all these distinct categories, that they have a moderate investment in competence, they have a high level of transferability, the investment in network is low, the investment capital is low, diversification capacity is very high, so they don't need to be so active. Risk preferences, well, it could be high, it could be low, whatever. The liquidity preference, they don't have so much high liquidity preferences. It sums up to a governance strategy that is quite passive. So if the owner is passive, I really don't know how to govern this corporation. Let's put all these ownership functions into the hands of the board. That's why then you could assume that the board um, um, compensation will increase. You have to pay the board more because they have to be more competent, and you have to give them these incentives so the agency costs are higher, so the board compensation is higher. So that's why we end up with board compensation predicted to be high when you have financial governance strategy. On the other hand, you have the company governance strategy. That is when you have, like we said, family, individuals, and company. Individuals that are entrepreneur. Then you as an owner, you assume a lot of the principal cost because you have a high level of investment as a principal, as an owner in the corporation. You know about the corporation. You are very dependent on the corporation. You have a high investment in control of the corporation. So all in all, you get a very active governance strategy. You are active. Maybe you are on the board of directors. Maybe even one of your relatives is the CEO of the company. So the principal costs are not externalized. It's not left to others. You keep them at yourself. So you make a lot of investment yourself. Therefore, you don't spend so much on the board. So you don't compensate the board so much. You don't need to compensate them because they don't need to work so much. They don't need so high level of competence. So it's a low level of board compensation. So we have the assumption saying that if you have company governance strategy, you are very active. That means that the compensation of the board is low. If you have financial governance strategy, typical of institutional investors, you have a very passive governance strategy, which means that you have a high level of compensation to the board. We collect the data and look the findings here about governance. Here on the y-axis is the compensation, not in kronos, but in level. So it indicates the differences in compensation. So here you have the blue line, and this is the financial governance strategy. And here on this x-axis, you have the concentration of those that are representing financial governance strategy. So when you go to the right, you get much more of financial governance strategy. And look what's happening here. You get an increase when they increase in power. You get an increase in the compensation to the board. And then you have a maximum. In fact, it was a little bit controversial if this is really a good line. It's a rather well-fitted line, but there is a maximum. But if you look, then I've put out the percentile of observations, and here you have 75% of all the observations are to the left of this line. So most of the observations are in fact aligned, saying that the more of financial governance strategy you get because of the dominant owners, the more compensation you get to the board, which is according to our prediction. Then look at company governance strategy, those that are active. You also get a small increase of compensation, but not as comparable to financial. But very quickly you get at the optimum, and then the compensation decrease. So when you get more of power from those that are company governance strategy, you get a small increase in the board compensation, but then it decreases. And then I put here the percentage that from here here to the left you have 25% of the observations. So the dominant observations, frequent observations, are to the right, and if you look onto the right, it's a negative slope, so it goes down. So the more company governance strategy you get, the less board compensation you get. And this is, and then it's controlled for many different things, especially size, because size, the larger the size of a corporation, the higher is the board compensation. So here you can say that these slopes shows that owners make a difference. When you have owners that are representing financial governance strategy, you get higher compensation. And when you have those that are company governance strategy, families, business groups, you get lower compensation. So there is a difference between owners, and owners make a difference. That's quite a nice conclusion, isn't it? There is a difference, and maybe it's good that there are differences. But that, as I said, is for you to develop this theory, how the differences between owners can supplement or be competitive. So now let's go to something completely different.